Thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be doing this keynote lecture for a conference with such an important and timely theme. As you know, JPAL is in fact a research center of Korea University. So in that sense, I'm kind of, partly a member of the home team, so to speak. And I'm, thankful for this opportunity and look forward to your questions. So I think, as Professor Sundar Ramaswamy started, I think the economic impacts of the pandemic have been highly unequal. I think the it's unambiguously clear that the working classes have been by far the most adversely affected, and that rebuilding the economy on a sustainable footing is going to require attention to both growth and inclusion. Now, but like he also said, and he channeled many of my most favorite economists and quotes, including Alan Blinder on hard heads and soft hearts, is that the challenge right now is that nobody has money, right? The government is also starved for revenue, and so we kind of there is both a desperate need for supporting the poor through greater inclusion, but at the same time we need to recognize the strains on public finances. And so the traditional view in public finance is that there is a trade-off between equity and efficiency, and I'll talk more about this later. But I think one of the most important insights from both theory and evidence in development economics over the past 30-40 years is that there are classes of policies that can promote both equity and efficiency. And so when you're in that zone, there is in fact, there is no trade-off. So this is almost a free lunch, right? There is a free lunch because you can have policies that support the most disadvantaged, that also improve aggregate economic growth and development. And so as a society, given that pandemics and tend to be times of shrinking resources for everybody, it becomes much harder to make the case for kind of redistributive policies. And if we want to serve the disadvantaged better, as a broader polity, we would do well, I think, to focus on where we can also expand the pie. And what I want to talk about today is present one such idea, which I've been working on for some time, but it's particularly timely for this conference. So the outline of the talk is I'm going to discuss the key conceptual issues of both theory and evidence regarding the design, scope, and likely impact of universal income transfers. And then I'm going to present details of our specific proposal on an inclusive growth dividend and discuss its benefits. So this is, and my thinking on this has evolved over the past 10 years. And I've been working in particular with Paul Niehaus and Sandeep Suktankar over 10 years on a series of studies on DBT in India, including impacts in the NREGS, in the PDS across multiple states. And, last year, Maitreesh and I put all of these thoughts together in a policy paper for the India Policy Forum. And that's the paper that I assigned as prior reading. Okay, so what are the conceptual issues? And so the way I'm going to do this, again, channeling what Professor Ramaswamy said at the beginning, is spend the first half of the talk really talking about evidence, right? So global evidence and national evidence that's relevant to how we should think about income transfers as part of a portfolio of anti-poverty strategies and development strategies in India. And then spend the second half talking about the very specific proposal of the IGD. Okay, so what are some of these key conceptual issues? So when we talk about income transfers, again, everybody thinks that this is a good idea, but the money has to come from somewhere, right? So there is a question on direct provision of goods and services. There are issues of substitution versus supplementation. Should you be doing income instead of existing welfare programs? Should you be doing them on top of that? Given that the goals of many of these programs are to identify and support the most vulnerable, should we be targeting them, or should these be universal? And then, a common concern is that people may spend cash transfers and income transfers badly. So what does the evidence say about that? Another concern is that if you were just to hand out money, what is this going to do in terms of work incentives? And then there are issues in terms of how does this affect intra-household dynamics? And that's something, again, we have evidence on. And I want to then talk about some of the broader goals, in fact, that IFMR has done a lot of work on, given that it's the Institute of Financial Management and Research. And I'll discuss kind of implications on borrowing constraints, on mitigating risk, and on alleviating savings constraints. Okay, so So the first, I think, one of the most common criticisms of income transfers is this idea that it's going to crowd out spending on other important public items, okay, such as health or education. And so, well-known economists, both on the right and kind of the left, have been opposed to income transfers, okay. So on the right, people have opposed it, saying that it's really, it's an entitlement, it's a dole that's not warranted. On the left, people have opposed this, saying that it almost represents like you're giving up on the idea of a developmental state and moving towards a compensatory state, which is the language used by Ratin Roy, when he criticized the idea of income transfers a couple of years ago. Though I think he has come around to the merits of what we are presenting now. That's, I guess, more of a post-COVID phenomenon, and I'll come to that later. So the question is, how should we assess this concern? Okay, so this is obviously a very, very valid concern, and it's, there's completely reasonable views on the other side to think that you should be doing public goods. Okay, so I think the key consideration in assessing the opportunity cost of the funds is, where are we spending our money right now? Okay, so the two key public finance questions that matters is, how much are we spending on public goods that enhances productive capacity versus how much are we spending on redistribution? Okay, now, and if you look at what we're spending on redistribution, and that includes what I'm calling publicly provided private goods. Okay, so public health is a public good, but publicly provided curative services is in fact a publicly provided private good, right? Because when an individual goes to a government hospital, it is benefiting you and your family and not the larger public. So that is still a private good, but it's a publicly provided private good, as opposed to, say, vector control or just reducing infections, which is truly a public good. Okay, so I think the first concept we need to understand is, how much are we spending on public goods versus redistribution? And then within what we spend on redistribution, what is the quality and effectiveness of public expenditure that we spend over here? Okay, now I think in general, most economists believe, and the evidence suggests, that if you were to be spending money on public goods that enhance productive capacity, so this could be roads, it could be railways, it could be ports, it could be irrigation, that in general, the returns to spending on public goods and infrastructure typically seem to exceed the costs. Okay, but I think the important point to keep in mind when we think about India is kind of this unique experience in human history, where because we were the only large country to democratize at such a low level of per capita income, that there is already incredible political pressure for redistribution. Okay, so the majority of our budget actually gets spent on redistribution and not on public goods. So if you were to just look at, say, the budget on agriculture, we spend 11 times more on interest waivers and fertilizer subsidies than we spend on agriculture research and extension. Okay, so if you think about what are the classic public goods that would expand production, it would be, am I doing research to increase the production set in agriculture? And am I doing extension to farmers to make sure that they have access to the new technology that they're able to increase productivity? Okay, in practice, we woefully underspend on these areas of investment, and most of our budget anyway goes on redistribution. Okay, and it goes on things like, majority are kind of what you would call palliative relief, okay, rather than productive investments. So the question is, given so much of our money already goes to redistribution, then the benchmark for assessing cash transfers or income transfers is, how does this do relative to the redistribution component of the budget? Okay, and not necessarily the public goods component, because the public goods component is not happening because of political pressures anyway. Okay, so then the question becomes, what is the value for money under the status quo? And what the research kind of increasingly suggests is that the value for money on a whole range of government provided goods and services is incredibly low. And so the returns to simply increasing spending along existing patterns are also likely to be low. Okay, so I straddle the left and the right in terms of my own views in this, in that I feel like I'm more left of center in that I want more social spending, but I feel like I'm right in the sense that there is so much inefficiency in the status quo that I cannot in good conscience often argue for increasing spending, when increasing spending seems to be so inefficient if done in business as usual ways. Okay, so to give you some specific examples, right, my own work, again, these are all large-scale RCTs in education, where we find that public spending per student in government schools is 3 to 4 times higher than the cost per student in affordable private schools, but the private schools show equal or, in slightly better learning. Okay, so they're not that much better. They're really not that much better, but they spend a lot less money. Okay, so they kind of deliver some comparable quality at much lower cost. Now, health is even more striking. Okay, so 70% of primary healthcare visits in rural India today are to fee-charging supporting private providers. And even when the village has a public health clinic, people predominantly, the majority still goes to private providers. And again, I have a whole set of papers documenting quality of care across public and private, but some of the important constraints in the public sector just end up being very poor accountability, high absence, unreliable presence. And so from the perspective of, like, even if you're poor, you would rather have the predictability and reliability of the private guy being there than take the chance of traveling to the government clinic and finding nobody there. Okay, so in that sense, like, the revealed preference of what our citizens are doing already suggests that the valuation of what they are placing on publicly provided private goods is in fact very low. Okay, so one way to kind of provocatively ask this question is almost to say, what does it say about the quality of your product that you can't even give it away for free? Okay, and this situation is of course much kind of more extreme in the northern states. I think, the states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, have a longer tradition of investing in high quality public services, but the majority of the population of the country lives in places where the quality of public services is incredibly poor. Now, but this is not, I'm not going to extend this and make a blanket statement of saying private is better than public. In fact, there are tons of problems with private as well. And there is also enormous heterogeneity across time, space, and providers. So, one of my students a couple of years ago had a very influential dissertation that just got published in the American Economic Review, looking at charter schools in Liberia. And what he found was that even though on average private schools were doing better, there was enormous variation even among the private providers. Okay, so I think the larger message from public versus private is not to say that public is better or private is better on average, but that there is huge variation. Okay, and so what may make sense is going to be very different across time and space and context. Okay, so the way I have over time started approaching how do you create an architecture of service delivery that empowers the beneficiaries? Okay, so the problem today is that if you're poor, the government spends money in your name in publicly provided services, but doesn't give you a choice with regard to how that taxpayer money is available to you. Okay, so if you can afford it, you have multiple options, but if you cannot, then you're constrained to government options. Okay, so one broader way of thinking about an architecture of service delivery is to say, if I were to take the case of the PDS, okay, where DBT and PDS is this very controversial topic, but if you were to say that I'm going to keep the PDS, okay, but as an individual, you have a choice about whether you would rather avail the PDS or rather avail an equivalent income transfer. And so there will be places where you would much rather have the flexibility and of the income transfer, and there are places where markets don't function as well and where the public option is much better. Okay, so the key idea really is neither public nor private, okay, but better accountability for public money. Okay, so the way I think about income transfers from an investment landscape is almost think about it as an index fund for benchmarking quality of public expenditure. Okay, so in the world of investing, what John Bogle did 50 years ago with launching the first index funds and Vanguard was a landmark in terms of improving value for money for the retail investor, because before that you would have all of these mutual funds like charging 5%, 6% sales fees and charging 2% management fees, when really the returns are being produced by markets and not by kind of the funds. And so the index fund kind of just changed the benchmark to say, you might be a Warren Buffett, you might be able to beat the index, but the burden of proof is on you to show that you can beat the index. Okay, so similarly, given what we have seen in so many cases where the public sector is destroying taxpayer money, okay, I'm not saying that you should not have public services, but the burden of proof should be on saying, can you at least deliver more value than the same amount of money in the hands of the poor themselves? Okay, so the long-term vision here is to kind of build an architecture based on empowerment of the beneficiary and not privileging public or private. Okay, so that's kind of just, there are going to be other design issues. So, and maybe I've spent too much time on just like, service delivery, but it's just to give you a sense of how I see income transfers as one component of a portfolio of how we empower the poor. Okay, so then there's issues of substitution versus supplementation. And I think a lot of the UBI discussions in India have focused on substitution, saying that there's a lot of waste and leakage. Okay, the problem in practice is that substitution is both politically and practically risky. Okay, so we've been doing tons of work on DBT, and we see that last mile implementation issues are pervasive. Okay, so even something as simple as the DBT in 3 union territories, what we found was that in the government records, 99% of transfers are successfully made, but about 30% of households reported not receiving the transfers. Now, they just weren't checking their account. They hadn't gotten an SMS. Maybe it had gone to a different account. In ongoing work in Jharkhand, we found that about 30 to 50% of women, were not really getting their maternity benefits just because there are so many challenges of registration, etc. Okay, so based on all of our field experience, I cannot in good conscience recommend blanket substitution. Okay. Further, the political economy makes this very, very difficult. So, Arvind Subramaniam and I did this conversation about 5 years ago on charting a course for the Indian economy. And I think one of the important insights there is if you care about improving the effectiveness of public spending, it's always easier to improve the quality of new spending than it is to change existing spending. Okay. And politically, we are seeing that right now, right? With the farm protests. Now, you may agree or disagree with what's going on with the laws, but I think certainly there are some merits in what the laws are trying to do. But it's incredibly difficult to change existing patterns of spending because there are existing interest groups that have kind of organized around that. Okay. But that doesn't mean that we give up on income transfers, because what you're seeing, so from a public finance perspective, layered with political economy considerations, what I would say is that even if you can't kind of eliminate bad spending, let's at least try and improve the quality of the new spending. Okay. So, and in a way, that's what you're seeing with Raitu Bandhu and PM Kisan. Okay. Now, of course, politically, what you're seeing is this is more money to farmers. Okay. Nobody is kind of doing away with existing electricity or fertilizer subsidies. But at least on the margin, given that there was political demand for supporting farmers, I think most economists believe that doing this through income transfers was better than doing this through things like loan waivers, that we know have incredible downstream negative consequences in terms of, credit creation and starving credit, from industry. Okay. So I think, so my main takeaway from all of this is that the traditional view on UBI is to say that you need to do substitution. But my view is that relying on substitution for fiscal space is likely to delay the benefits of income transfers, and that as a country, we'll be better off with a modest supplementary income transfer that will allow us to get started on the pathway towards realizing the many benefits of income transfers for development. Okay. Now, then there's issues of targeted versus universal income transfer programs. Okay. And these issues are well known. Targeting creates, errors of inclusion and exclusion, increases potential for corruption and leakage during implementation, increases administrative costs of determining who should be targeted, and cost to beneficiaries. So in many ways, what happens is the targeting creates a bunch of deadweight loss, right? On the administrative costs on the government side, as well as administrative costs on the beneficiary side. And in fact, in practice, the paperwork for targeting itself ends up being regressive because the poorest of the poor often find it harder to complete the paperwork. Now, and I think the other important point that was highlighted by the migrant crisis is that most targeting regimes in India are static. Okay, so you can have an SECC exercise in 2011 that says here are the poor, but that has not been updated in 10 years. Okay, so, and because so much poverty is stochastic because of exposure to shocks, whether it's rainfall shocks or whether it's kind of a COVID shock, as we saw with migrant workers, any kind of targeting regime in an informal economy. So, in a highly formal economy, you can use the tax forms as a way of doing dynamic targeting. So because in the US, everybody is expected to file a tax return regardless of whether you're paying taxes, the government automatically has annual data on where you are, and therefore there are automatic stabilizers that can kick in terms of compensatory government programs when your income has gone down. The problem in India with a 95% informal economy is we just don't have that ability to get real-time data. Okay, so given the stochastic nature of poverty and exposure to shocks, the targeting regime can be particularly inappropriate to deal with that. Okay, and then I think there are also universal programs in general have broader political support. Okay, now of course the main advantage of targeting is that if you target, you can have larger transfers for the poor. Okay, and so there's clearly the sense of like, why should Ambani be getting the same amount of money as somebody who's poor? But I think what's interesting is that there is a certain benefit of universality, which I'll come to in a moment. But if you look at the incentive effects of targeted transfers may in fact be much worse. And that's because what happens is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, that the problem with the targeted transfer is you also need to phase it out. Okay, so let's look at the comparison of, say, PM Kisan versus Nyay. Okay, so Nyay was an example of a program that tried to have large transfers for the bottom 20%. Okay, so it said we'll give you close to 5,000 rupees a month. It'll be a large transfer so that there's a meaningful improvement. Okay, but the reason this ends up being a poorly designed program is when the program is so large for the poor, you're going to create a lot more political economy in targeting and who gets on the list. But also, remember, now somebody at the 19th percentile of the income distribution is going to be much better off than the 21st percentile. Okay, so you actually create a very, very high marginal tax rate around the phase out period. And what the evidence suggests is that that can be a bigger disincentive in keeping people in a poverty trap. Okay, so the main point I think I want you to understand is if you have a large transfer for a smaller number of people, you're also going to have a phase out as people kind of get, earn higher incomes. And that phasing out of the public benefit actually creates a very high marginal tax rate, which can actually exacerbate a poverty trap. Okay, so that's the other problem with targeting, which is not often discussed. Okay, so then a very, very common question is, will people spend cash transfers badly? Okay, and this is a common concern, but there's very, very little evidence to support it. Okay, so I think there is some evidence that people spend lotteries badly. Okay, so if you get a big windfall income, okay, then people don't know what to do. And, if you don't have habits of savings or kind of understanding how to annuitize your windfall, people may spend it badly. Okay, so similarly, one of the problems, for example, for farmers in India is like, when you sell your land, if you get a windfall payment, then often that money goes away very fast, and then you're back in destitution because you haven't been taught how to take that windfall and annuitize it or invest it in other productive kind of income generating activities. But if you look at the how people spend small transfers from pretty much any anti-poverty cash transfer program in the world, there is almost no study, okay, that finds increased spending on alcohol or tobacco, or at least that's higher than the income share. Okay, so people might spend 3% of income on this and they'll continue spending 3%, and that's fine. And if anything, there's some evidence that people may reduce their spending on alcohol and tobacco. And when you think about the psychology of this, it's actually easy to understand, because a lot of the spending on alcohol and tobacco is actually more of an antidepressant. And so when people have money and have hope, in fact, the research suggests that that kind of spending goes down. Okay, so almost all the studies have found that, people increase spending on household food expenditure, school attendance, health services, dietary diversity, savings, livestock ownership, and Seva did a similar study in Madhya Pradesh, and they again found very similar results. So I think, in general, one of the challenges of kind of the poverty discourse in India is that the people who advocate for the poor are also the people who kind of tend to not respect the agency of the poor as much and want to microscript what happens with the income for the poor. And I think in general, my colleague Paul Niehaus, who's been one of the world leaders pushing this idea of kind of what you might call left libertarian, right? Which is, you want to be kind of center left in terms of supporting the poor, but you want to be libertarian in terms of supporting the agency of the poor, which would also be consistent, with an Amartya Senian view, that the problem of poverty is in fact the lack of agency and empowerment. Okay, so now, of course, the source of problem that happens in cash transfer debates is often what happens is each line ministry that has a budget, when they consider a switch to DBT, they want all the money to be spent on its own vertical. Okay, and that's unrealistic and the wrong way to think about the problem, right? Because income is obviously fungible, and people will spend according to the Engel curves and income elasticity trajectory of whatever they're spending on. So that is the wrong way to think about the problem. So if I'm saying, if I'm converting PBS into a cash transfer, I should not expect all of that money to be spent on food. It's because people are spending money of their own accord on food anyway. So in the end, it should not kind of make a difference. Okay, so now I've already talked a little bit about effect on work incentives, okay? And basically for both developing and developed countries, there's tons of review papers. Abhijit Banerjee wrote one last year. And, tons of studies basically find very little evidence of negative effects on labor supply. And if anything, there's studies in Iran that showed that a modest UBI, in fact, increased the labor supply of women in self-employment. And I'll come back and explain reasons for that. Okay, and which is basically, one way to think about this is, see, how does development happen? Okay, all of development is, if you think about development as increasing productivity, okay, being able to produce more with less, all development requires an upfront investment that will hopefully pay off in the future. Okay, and all investments are risky. Okay, so there is kind of evidence to suggest that when people are very, very poor, that having some modest amount of insurance, which is what a UBI or a modest income transfer would provide, will actually increase their ability to take the modest risks that are needed to then get to higher income trajectories. Okay, so the key is, again, and this is why the IGD is going to propose a small amount, is to keep the amounts modest without a phase out. Okay, and so and this is the point I just said in the previous point, which is a lot of policy commentators kind of misunderstand and think that providing income creates a disincentive for work. In fact, if you look at the incentives and the evidence, it's the phase out that actually causes the bigger incentive problem and not the transfer itself. Okay, now coming to then female empowerment, there's a lot of evidence that transfers into women's bank accounts, like increase women's empowerment, including work, done through JPAL and IFMR, random RCTs where randomly assigned women to receive transfers for NREGA, and those who receive the money to their own accounts showed higher levels of empowerment. And then there's also some very fascinating recent work about intra-household inequality. Okay, so much of our policy regime with regard to anti-poverty in India targets at the household level, but there is now increasing evidence that there is a huge intra-household gradient of consumption. Okay, so therefore you can often have poor people in non-poor households, and you can have not poor people in poor households because of the intra-household inequality in consumption, with women, children, and elderly being particularly at risk of living in poverty, even within households that on an average basis are above the poverty line. Okay, so a universal non-targeted income transfer with the allowance for children going into mothers' accounts may actually help improve the intra-household targeting to the most vulnerable members of a society relative to a system that targets to the household and then allows the male head of household to control those resources. Okay, now the next big thing is about relaxing borrowing constraints. And this is, a huge enough subject that there are hundreds of papers, both theoretical and empirical, right, written on how kind of credit constraints act as a poverty trap, right? Because people, if the whole process of development again requires making investments that give you a positive return, if you can't access credit to make that investment, how are you going to bootstrap your way out of poverty? Okay, so now, so there's a bunch of studies, including, done by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo with garment manufacturers in Tamil Nadu, studies in Sri Lanka. So there's a bunch of studies that show that returns to capital in developing countries are quite high, okay, in the range of 30 to 50%, if not even higher. Okay, now, but the problem is that if you look at the returns to microcredit, right? And obviously a lot of people have talked about microcredit as going to be transformative. And that's what, there was that drove a Nobel Prize for Mohammed Yunus. But again, what Esther and Abhijit and others have shown with kind of large-scale RCTs in multiple settings is that the average return to microcredit seems to be quite low. And most of the return seems to go to the right-hand tail. Okay, so there's going to be some entrepreneurs who do very well and kind of they do incredibly well. But when you hear microcredit kind of, evangelizers talking about the great success stories, they're clearly cherry picking the right tail as opposed to presenting you the average. Okay, so if you look at the results on the average, the pessimistic view is that credit by itself is not going to be transformative. Okay, but I take a very optimistic view on this. Okay, so the optimistic view I take on this is that if microcredit on average is generating zero returns, okay, remember the average interest rate on microcredit is about 25%. Okay, so what that means is that people have either investment opportunities or consumption smoothing opportunities that are generating an IRR of 25%, but these returns are mainly being absorbed by interest costs. Okay, and it's not even that these are usurious interest costs, because it actually reflects the intermediation cost, right? Because the intermediation cost is high when your loan ticket size is small. Okay, so one way to think about this is that we have been spending all our time barking up this tree of credit constraints, but because of the intermediation cost, that is putting about a 25% wedge between what is the true return on capital versus what is realized through a microfinance channel. Okay, so if you're instead able to put that money directly in people's accounts without that intermediation cost, you can basically generate returns of about 25%, like, that directly go to the poor, without this intermediation cost. Now, of course, banks and financial institutions have much more interest in promoting credit than promoting savings because they make much more money on credit. Okay. But I think the point from a social return perspective is if you can put that money in the hands of the poor without the intermediation cost, then those returns over time are going to accrue to the poor. And some of this is going to help with consumption smoothing, but some of this will also help with borrowing. Okay, so all your classic models of credit constraints talk about collateral as the constraint, but in fact, there's a very nice recent paper. It's a macro and finance paper that shows that if you look at how banks are actually making credit, they care more about cash flow than collateral, right? Because they care about, can you service the debt? Because even if I give you a lumpy piece of collateral, liquidating that collateral against a non-payment is much more kind of transaction cost heavy. So when I'm assessing credit worthiness, the banks care much more about cash flow. Okay. And so if you're putting cash flow in people's accounts, then you may be able to kind of augment their capacity to borrow at a lower interest rate because the credit risk is now lowered because they have the ability to service the payment. And there's another very interesting, again, paper that all of this was kind of come out of JPAL, IFMR lead, and this is in some ways the banyan tree that has grown fruit, I think from JPAL and lead and all of these research institutions that CREA and IFMR have supported over the past 15 years, is that, this is again, very nice paper by Rohini Pandey and Erica Field that basically says that a big limitation of microfinance today is that because they start insisting on payments, so the typical loan might be, you borrow 1,000 rupees and you pay back 1,200 rupees, so you pay back 100 rupees every month over a year. Okay, so 12 installments. So you're typically paying back 120% of the 100% that you borrow at 10% each, at 10 rupees each month. And so that gives you an IRR of about 25%. But notice that the problem here is that now the reason this is the schedule of repayment that's used is because you want to build the repayment culture and the discipline. But the problem when you start insisting on those payments each month is it makes it very difficult to make illiquid investments, right? So any kind of productive investment, you're going to need working capital, and the capital is going to be tied up, and your ability to service the loan is going to be a function of when you're actually able to make the sale, which in many cases may be further out. Okay, so what this very kind of simple but powerful study shows is that simply changing the terms of the microfinance contract that allows more illiquid investments by requiring the first payment to come at a later time was kind of significantly increase the productivity of the investments that people were making. Okay, so again, if you were to combine what we've learned from all of this research, then you see the value of modest cash flow in people's accounts because it then allows them to make the investment without needing to break that investment to service the debt itself. Okay. So then there's, mitigating risk. I've already talked about this, okay, that, even small sums of income transfers can have large effects on income generation and also contribute towards providing some subsistence. And poor households face very high risk and seasonality of income. Only about 10% have any kind of insurance. But yet with insurance, farmers choose crops that are riskier and have higher average returns, okay? So, and in fact, on a different note, a very, very powerful study by Mushfiq Mubarak and others in Bangladesh, right? Very famous study published in Econometrica shows that, even migration is fundamentally it's a high return investment, right? So one of the big puzzles in development economics is that why is there so less migration given that the wages are so much higher in urban areas and there is really no economic activity in rural areas? And it turns out that for the poor, even paying the search cost of a bus ticket can be enough of a barrier, because if you buy the bus ticket and don't find a job, you can't afford that 40 or 50 rupees for the bus ticket. And so what they found was simply providing people a bus ticket with a chance to go and look for a job in an urban area kind of had enormous kind of long-term returns. Okay, so, and that's the way in which these small regular payments allow you to make these micro investments that may help you leapfrog into a higher income path over time. Okay, and then, savings. So I've kind of implicitly talked about this already, right? So if you think about a cycle of credit versus a cycle of savings, these are fundamentally very, very similar, right? Because what happens in a savings cycle is I pay myself into the bank account, I pay, and then I have a consumption event. In credit, I have a consumption event, and then I pay installments, and then I take another credit, right? Now, but the difference in those two cycles is that in the credit cycle, the poor are paying 25% and compounding that over time. The returns of moving people from a credit cycle to a savings cycle compounded over time can be enormous. But part of our problems right now is that, even when we are creating all these Jan Dhan accounts, like the utilization ends up being low, partly because, there isn't money in these accounts. Okay. So in the Indian context, the recent RCT in Chhattisgarh showed that, savings increase significantly when earnings are directly deposited in bank accounts. Okay, so given all of this research, the second half of the talk, and how much time do I have? Okay, wow, all right. So maybe I won't be able to take that many questions, but I'll plow through. Now that I've mentioned the research, I can do this much faster. Okay, so what is an IGD? The idea is very, very simple. Okay, it's a universal supplemental income transfer pegged at about 1% of GDP per capita. Almost identical to PM Kisan, but universalized, paid at the individual as opposed to the household level, with allowance for children being paid into mothers' accounts. Okay, so and I just want to walk you through the many, many ways in which I believe this can be transformative for India. Okay, walking through first the terminology itself, right? Now, I think the problem with the UBI debate is that while a lot of these arguments that are made above like are implicit in the UBI, so it's not like I've said things that are that new except with more evidence. The problem is that basic income connotes an amount that is adequate to live on, okay? And that sets the expectation that the transfer amount will be large enough to eliminate poverty. And the moment you're talking about such large numbers, it's infeasible to get there without either eliminating other schemes or substantially increasing tax collections. And both of these are practically and politically daunting tasks. Okay, so the logic of the terminology is when you say dividend, it's very, very clear that it's one component of a portfolio of people's income streams. Inclusive is because it's built in progressivity, right? So, yes, Ambani gets the same thing as the poorest person, but this is something that there is shared solidarity and there is built in progressivity, right? So obviously this is a much, much bigger deal for the poor as a fraction of their income. And there is no exclusion errors, which is kind of where the inclusivity comes from. And the word growth captures the fact that this amount will grow along with the growth of the overall economy. So in a way, what we're doing is it's almost like we're giving every citizen an equity share in the overall economy. And therefore, even if it's only 1%, you're kind of building in the sense of inclusiveness of every citizen that grows along with the overall growth path of the economy. Okay, so and that's why I think beyond the economics, I think it's a very powerful symbol of universally shared prosperity that connects every citizen, right, regardless of income or station. And, the idea, in fact, Sunil Khilnani wrote about this close to 10 years ago. He called it a citizens' growth dividend. Debraj Ray has written about it in the context of a universal basic share. So I think in that sense, again, it's not even like the idea is uniquely ours. I think the main thing we're doing is pulling together an entire body of evidence over the past 10 to 15 years. I think when Sunil was writing about this, he was writing this much more as kind of a tool, as an instrument of political solidarity. Whereas I think we think about this as a deep tool of kind of broad-based economic development. Okay, so and I think in a post-COVID time, it's especially important. I think it's a testament to the kind of I would say, the strength of India's social fabric, right? That despite the economic hardship, now, of course, you're seeing the protests with the farmers right now, because obviously you will protest when you feel threatened by a policy. But in general, societies, you see this in the US, you see this everywhere, that increase in economic hardship has raised social conflict. Okay, so the importance of a public investment in shared solidarity becomes especially high, and this becomes a credible, visible way of doing this. Okay, now, the other big point is that this is affordable enough to be feasible. Okay, so like I've said, at 3.5 to 10% of GDP for UBI, you simply can't do this. Okay, but a 1% of GDP is kind of not that different from universalizing PM Kisan. So PM Kisan right now has a budget of about 0.4% of GDP. Now, of course, it is more money, but given what I'm going to tell you later about the evidence on the fiscal multiplier effects of these transfers, given the economic downturn in which we are in, this thing could almost be self-financing or more, cover a substantial amount of the cost. So it's feasible for a supplemental transfer. It improves on PM Kisan in important ways. It will also reach landless laborers, those without formal title to land. And the other interesting thing, again, is as an economist, when you think about long-term growth and structural transformation, see, the fundamental problem with farming in India today, it's politically difficult to say this, but any analyst of agriculture in India will tell you that the fundamental problem is there are too many farmers. So the US produces more food with 2% of its population in agriculture. So the way every country in history has developed is through a structural transformation of reducing the fraction of your workforce in agriculture. And so because those fewer farmers are producing more food, that's how the incomes kind of rise, but there is no way out. Whereas the problem of a structure of our farm support is that because it actually incentivizes inefficient cultivation, we are, in fact, a finance secretary of an Indian state once told me, he said, listen, it would be better for the country to just pay farmers farmers not to grow, because with the current subsidy regime, what it's doing to the groundwater table and all of the subsidies is actually there is value destruction in every kind of extra ton of paddy that is produced in this country. Okay, so in a way, it kind of, by making this independent of occupation, it actually increases the likelihood of a structural transformation, because you're going to get the benefit regardless of whether you choose to remain a farmer or not. And you reduce gaming by being at the individual level as opposed to household level, right? So if PM Kisan says I'm doing this at the household level, there's obvious incentives for joint families to kind of break up and report themselves as multiple households. Okay, now, and again, given where we are, a fiscal constraints bind. I mean, I presented to the Finance Commission and others. And so clearly we may not have 1% of GDP right now, but at the very least, we could start in some of the 10% of the poorest districts or blocks in the country and make the transfers universal within that. Okay, so it's similar to how programs such as NREGA had been initially rolled out to the most disadvantaged parts of the country. And this can be accompanied by a high quality evaluation that will then allow us to see if these promises that I'm talking about are just theoretical or in fact they turn out to be true in practice. Okay, so I've already talked about this. It's progressive, inclusive, and sustained poverty reduction. An IGD would augment monthly consumption by 10% or more for the bottom 30%. And in fact, I think it's 11%. The slide didn't update. And if you were to define the ultra poor to be the bottom 5th percentile, an IGD would in fact move everybody out of that extremely low threshold. By being universal, you reduce the risk of exclusion, almost minimize it. And I think the other really important point is one big lesson from the COVID and the migrant crisis is that India's social protection architecture right now is completely non-portable, right? Because both your NREGA and PDS are linked to domicile, whereas what you need in a country with kind of 100 million plus migrants is you want your benefits and social protection architecture to be portable. And so if the benefits are portable, in fact, that would both minimize distortion and reduce misallocation, and also may have mitigated some of the worst negative effects of the downturn. Okay, so by pegging the transfer value to a fraction of GDP, the IGD has a built-in indexation and will grow over time. So one of the important concerns of people like Jean Drez with like cash transfers in the past, and why like a Jean and activists are very, very suspicious about replacing, say, PDS entitlements with cash, is because they just don't trust the government to keep the value of the benefits with indexation. Okay, and I think Jean gives a powerful example of widows' pensions that I think stuck at 200 rupees a month for like about 15 years from 2005. Okay, so it's a real concern. And so that's why like building in the indexation into the design kind of addresses that concern. Okay, so this is just looking at the numbers and saying that, sitting in Bombay or Delhi or Chennai, like, I mean, 100 rupees a month, 110 rupees a month might seem completely trivial. But, for the bottom 10, 30, 20% of this country, like, I mean, this is now actually over 10% of income. And can well make the difference between destitution and and having something to eat in adverse times. Okay, now I think the other important thing that people forget in terms of anti-poverty programs, if you look at the US, okay, so why is there this, one of the biggest political puzzles in the US has been that why does the white working class, okay, why do they object to welfare even when it will actually help them? Okay, and that's because there is a perception that has been created that the people who will benefit the most are people who are poorer than them. Okay, and so basically the psychology of poverty, okay, is such that people absolutely hate programs that change the relative rankings of household by income. Okay, so there is a sense that says that, listen, yes, I am poor, but if there is a policy that makes somebody who's poorer than me tomorrow better, then I might be poor at the 21st percentile, but I'm going to oppose tooth and nail anything that's going to reverse the rank within my community. Okay, so, and it is very well documented that people care about relative income and status as well as income and poverty. There's evidence of negative psychological effects on non-recipients of transfers. Okay, so an IGD elegantly avoids all of these sociological and psychological challenges, right? Because by being universal and not excluding anyone, you're actually preserving relative ranking, right? Like, by construction, you preserve the relative rank and say, listen, we're giving everybody a boost up, but if you work hard and if you earn more, there might be a slightly higher tax rate, of course, because in general equilibrium, this has to be financed by a progressive tax rate. But an IGD combined with a progressive tax is both progressive, but psychologically, sociologically, will be much more acceptable, because what kind of the ethnographic research on why kind of lower middle classes oppose welfare programs kind of points very strongly to this kind of aversion to rank reversals and rank preservation as an important objective sociologically. So then again, we've got the evidence on DBT into mothers' accounts, and just having worked on DBT and these issues for now over 10 years, I just think the gender empowerment component of this alone may be worth trying this thing on a pilot basis, particularly putting kind of the allowance for children into mothers' accounts. If you want, you could call this a baby bond, like that says this is a joint account with the child and the mother that matures at the age of 18. So a mother can choose to grow that and give it to the child at 18. But given what we know that the returns to early childhood investments and cognitive development are so high, you would want to then supplement these transfers with information campaigns that then help mothers spend this on kind of early childhood health and nutrition. So, I think that would be something that I'd be very excited about testing. I think work incentives, I've already talked about this, that the value is just too small, okay, to have adverse impacts on incentive to work. But if anything, I'm pretty confident that it would increase worker productivity and aggregate economic growth. So there's this very nice and powerful study in Kenya, again done by Paul Niehaus and co-authors, where they did a large-scale UCT study and estimated that the fiscal multiplier of this was about 2.7, okay, which means for every 100 rupees that was dropped into this economy, total economic activity went up by 270. And that's basically working through demand multiplier effects, okay? So this is classic Keynesian work, but, again, we underestimate, and Rathin Roy and others have written about this, that how much of the India growth story of the past 15 years has been like a top-down, trickle-down story, right? There are people who are working in kind of the global labor market with exportable goods who are paid by MNCs, who in urban areas then, or, any kind of formal company, who then generate demand for the next 30% in urban areas through kind of literally the service economy that supports that top 10%. And the bottom 60% has pretty much just been left out, okay? So the point is that if you care about Atmanirbhar and care about supporting domestic manufacturing and domestic industry, you need to boost domestic demand. And that domestic demand, is going to be boosted the most by kind of augmenting income at the bottom of the pyramid, okay? So then coming to financial inclusion, the households at the 25th percentile and below of the Indian wealth distribution had zero financial assets and savings. Okay, so even at the median, financial savings is only about 2,000 rupees. So Jan Dhan has massively expanded account creation. But I think when Arun Jaitley answered in the Rajya Sabha in 2018, December, 23% of Jan Dhan accounts were actually dormant, okay? And even those with accounts barely use them, all right? So a regular inflow of funds into these accounts will lead to greater use of the accounts, and by definition, they'll be active and can help move people from a cycle of credit to a cycle of savings, and also ease credit access for those seeking capital for business expansion. And I think the last two things which I get so excited about is this broader theme of state capacity. Okay, so over the last 20 years, I've been working on health and education and anti-poverty programs. And the truth is, while we focus so much of our attention on policy, the real binding constraint in India is the weakness of the state in implementing anything. Okay, so just implementing an IGD would involve identifying every citizen, matching him or her to a bank account, a parent or guardian, and reliably sending a monthly transfer to 1.3 billion people. Okay, so it would have the indirect benefit of developing demonstrable state capacity to credibly reach every citizen and reliably deliver a benefit for the first time in independent India. And in the longer term, I see this as kind of state capacity because you would also strengthen tax collection capacity by connecting citizens to the state. It would improve the pricing of scarce resources such as water and clean air. So, I think most economists, environmental economists, ecologists would say that the right way to support farmers who might need water for irrigation is to say, I'm going to give you like a certain amount of free units, and then above that charge you market price, because I want to protect you through income as opposed through prices. Because when the water is free is when you basically get this incredibly suboptimal cultivation of paddy in parts of the country that have no business growing paddy, and is the single biggest source of India's groundwater crisis is essentially our agriculture policies, right? So, and this is the economics is really, really easy, right? It's Econ 101 is to say support the poor through prices, through income, and not through prices. The problem today is that you don't have the capacity to credibly say, I'm going to charge you market prices and give you the DBT, because you don't actually have the ability to credibly reach these accounts. So whether it's clean air, okay, we should be raising carbon taxes, but then we should be rebating that into universal income transfers. And so once you have the ability to show citizens that you can reach them with these income transfers, it dramatically improves the feasible set of public policy, correct? So that's the sense in which I see this as a foundational investment in state capacity. And this is no longer a pipe dream, right? Part of the point is the investment in Jan Dhan and Aadhaar and mobile was supposed to do this, but that final step of actually using this pipe pipeline to predictably, credibly do this has not yet been done. And so in some ways, like, this is tailor-made for the Prime Minister's own kind of slogan of Sabka Saath, which is something that reaches everybody, Sabka Vikas, that promotes universal development, and Sabka Vishwas, because, for the first time, the government of India would have demonstrated that it can reach every citizen on a monthly basis. Okay, so politically also this would make sense. And finally, like I've said, using IGD as a benchmark for development spending and enabler of choice, I think in the long term, I see this as transformative because it can be an index fund for development spending that once you show that you can deliver the cash, it actually empowers people to make more choices about how tax money in their name is actually spent. Okay, so my last slide is, given all of this, right? Like, how do we make it happen? So, there's a very, very strong case for the government of India to do this. Even though there is a fiscal kind of strain, everybody, bond markets, all credit analysts, everybody, will say that the Indian stimulus has been much, much lower than anywhere else in the world. Now, to be fair, I think the government will reasonably argue that the US can issue infinite debt because it's kind of issuing the sovereign reserve currency of the world, and India has to worry about what the bond markets are saying. Now, but the point is this, right? If you look at fiscal deficit numbers, the 3% or 4% at some level is a completely arbitrary number, right? The reason the markets impose that on you is because they don't trust the government, because governments will typically waste the money, okay? But if you can tell a coherent narrative to the markets as to why this is an investment, that any borrowing for this is going to be ring-fenced for an investment that you can show is going to generate these returns, then, the markets will be much more forgiving when there is clarity and transparency of communication from the government about both what the true deficits are and kind of using a medium-term expenditure framework within which you give the markets the assurance that, this money is going to be spent sensibly. Okay, so my personal view is I would like to see this happen ASAP, right? And I think it would be a third pillar of the social safety net along with NREGA and PDS. Portability is a key benefit, and in just that amount may have prevented or mitigated the massive migrant crisis we saw. I think the case for this is that it would not just boost social protection, but boost the overall economy. The current approach to economic recovery has relied heavily on credit, okay? But we know that that is just evergreening and rolling over the problem, okay? So every MSME I talk to, will say that demand is the key constraint and that they're not going to borrow without the demand. And so the multipliers are likely to be even larger, right? So this is kind of Econ 101, that in times of slack, these multipliers are going to be even bigger. And like I've said, the commentators have talked about how India's development in recent years has been driven essentially by incomes and consumption of the top 10%. And so if we're serious about using the crisis for Atmanirbhar, like the foundation of that would be boosting demand of the poor, and that can accelerate this process. And I think my larger point I want to make is most of the discourse on kind of poverty reduction, inclusion in India, it tends to be discussed more in terms of, charity is too strong a word, but more in terms of moral obligations. But I think you should actually reframe how we think about this as an engine for broad-based economic growth. So my own priors were shifted dramatically from our work on NREGA in AP, right? So, most economists, including myself in 2005 or 6, were quite skeptical of NREGA, believing that, this would boost wages without boosting productivity. But what we saw was that because of the asymmetry of market power and monopsony power of landlords, that improving NREGA implementation not only boosted wages, but also boosted employment. And then when we looked at the longer term effects in the socioeconomic census, in the economic census, we saw increases in employment and increases in establishments. And we're finding gains in every census data set we've looked at. So in that sense, building an engine of growth in a bottom-up way, I think will help both inclusion and growth. And if government of India will not do this, I think, states can also consider pilots and evaluations on their own account. So Telangana led on Raitu Bandhu and it quickly got replicated. So in fact, we have an active proposal under consideration with a state government, which we hope should get finalized soon. And JPAL will be leading like a large scale evaluation of this. So in that sense, IFMR and CREA continue to be part of the story, both in terms of creating the evidence and hopefully continuing to generate evidence based on the recommendations that come out of all of this work. So anyway, even by my standards, I think that was fast, but hopefully it was clear. So let me stop there.